And today's meeting will be pretty much focused on annual reports from each of the scientific advisory groups, but we'll have a chance to get some opening remarks and some updates from ANR and Fish and Wildlife. First order of business, I don't think we've got anyone online from outside of this group, but any comments from the public not related to the agenda? Hearing none. Any changes to the agenda? And I guess in particular, I'm looking at any of the scientific advisory groups that might need to go earlier or later based on your availability. Seems like folks are good. Excellent. So with that, I'm looking for approval of the 12 September 2023 minutes. Yeah.
I wasn't at that meeting, and I think it says I was.
Okay.
That's probably my credit for stuff I didn't do.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for that, Allie. Any others?
I'm listed twice, both as a member.
I
and
saw
non-member. So
Okay. I guess what I'll do is look for a motion to approve the minutes with those two friendly amendments. Thanks, Stephanie. Go for a second, Paul.
Yeah, I'll make the motion to accept the minutes from the previous meeting.
Okay, I'll say we've got a second. All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Moving on, and I don't know, maybe I'm thinking before I turn it over to you.
Sorry, Alan.
Yeah.
I'll abstain on that vote because I wasn't at the meeting.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, Brian. So one abstention.
Yeah, I guess
Two. Okay. All right. Maybe we'll do just a quick round of introductions, but before we jump into the secretary's report. So Alan Strong, he, him, his pronouns, and I am the chair of the Endangered Species Committee on the fauna representation.
I'm program manager for the wildlife diversity program in Fish and Wildlife.
Alex Siba, UVM Extension, and I am the subcultural representative.
Brianna Ferreira, I'm a forest health specialist with FDR, and I'm here representing the Humboldt SAG.
Jim Anderson, I chair the Reptile Amphibian Scientific Advisory Group.
Chris Langdon, I chair the Fish SAG.
I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources.
Ron Austin, Director of Wildlife with the Fish and Wildlife Department.
Stephanie Smith with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
Do we skip me? I'm not on your board.
Go for it. Yes.
I'm Pam Breyer. I'm with Stephanie. I'm recently hired into the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets as the agricultural toxicologist, agricultural toxicologist.
Mark LeBar, I'm on Vermont chair of the Bird SAG.
Okay. Well,
Chris Herrick, I'm the commissioner of the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
and we can go online. Kent.
Hi, I'm Kent McFarland, Vermont Center for Eco Studies. I'm the chair for the Invertebrate SAG.
Brian.
I'm Brian Pfeiffer. I'm a faunal member of the committee and a member of the Invertebrate SAG.
Carla.
Hi, everyone. Carla Fenner. I'm a member of the ESC representing Flora on the Flora SAG and liaison to the Endangered Species Committee for the HERP SAG.
We like the albums in on your background, Carla. Am I seeing Jim Croce? Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't want to tease anyone, but I'm on a snowbird situation. I'm in San Diego for a few months, so this is the nice rental house decor.
Dorothy.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Allard, former chair
of the Endangered Species Committee. I'm on the Flora Advisory Group, and now I chair the new Bryophyte Species Advisory Group.
And Paul.
Paul Wizarek, I'm an Endangered Species Committee member, and I represent agricultural interests on the committee.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Oh, Matt, you've got to introduce yourself. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, and so probably most of you have noticed that a familiar face around the table is not here today, Mark Scott, who has retired, and I'll turn it over to
Yeah.
Chris to sort of.
As you say,
formally
Mark
introduce
has been sitting here for a very long time. Mark retired in September, and I'm happy to report that John Austin, who has a long history with the department, has been hired on as the wildlife director. I don't know if you want to just give a couple minutes bio about yourself, John, but it's pretty impressive. But we're really happy to have John in this position, and so.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I know many of you, not all of you. I'm looking forward to you in my new role. I miss Mark Scott. Mark was a good friend, colleague, and mentor for a long time. So I'm honored to be in the position now as Director of Wildlife. I feel a little like I must have rocks in my head to agree to take this on, but we're going to do the best we can. There's a lot of challenges in front of us, which I've been with the Fish and Wildlife Department for coming up on 30 years now as a full-time employee, but actually I started my career with the department back in the 1980s when I was a student at the University of Vermont, the wildlife program. So I've been a wildlife biologist with the department, and years ago, 2008, 2010, I interacted with this committee at the time because I served for a couple of years as the acting division director. So I've kind of missed interacting with this part of our forward to re-engaging. Yeah, so I've been the Lands and Habitat Program Manager in the Wildlife Division for the last, 15, 16 years, where I've been responsible for overseeing the department's interests in everything land conservation and management related. I really enjoyed that work. I'm still kind of wearing both hats at the moment, really back on my position. So that was a big consideration for me in making the leap to Director of Wildlife, because I found a lot of rewarding work that I was doing. But I'll still have a hand in that, in addition to having a hand in Roz's world and Dave Saxville's world, and everything wildlife related. People like Roz have heard me say this so many times, you're probably ready to retch every time I bring it up, but I do like to share this with people because it's important. After working with this organization for 30 years now, I still get up every day and consider it a privilege to go to work and get to say that my job is to represent the public interest in wildlife conservation. That's a pretty cool thing to do, especially in a place like Vermont. And there's only 30 some of us that get to do that. People would give their left arm to have that as their responsibility in life. So I don't take it for granted. I take it very seriously. And, to do with all of you today.
You can see why we hired him.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John, and great to have you here. Looking forward to working with you. Secretary Moore, take it away. Updates from ANR.
Sure. Thank you for having me this morning, and I apologize that I'll have to duck out. Oh, did somebody replace the whole clock, not just the batteries?
Oh, that was it fell off the string.
Oh,
And Alan was having a tough time with the clock angle, so we just went with that for now.
All right. Well, it's better anyways, because I just reset the time twice in the last week, and it hasn't took. So I will have to duck out about 9:30. I have to make a trip to Maine today, actually. So, but thank you for accommodating me. Pleasure to be here with you. Thought I could provide a few updates, although I'm sure Commissioner Herrick can go into more detail on several topics, but just thought I would start by giving a little bit of update on what we're looking at during the legislature, both this session and then continuing some of the work we were charged with last session. As folks probably know, the governor's budget address is later today. And, you know, it's things have sort of returned to normal, maybe is the way to say it, as opposed to where we've been up in the stratosphere the last several years. That said, the agency's budget at this point is more than double what it was when I started in this job 7 years ago. Almost 80% of that increase is federal pass-through funding. Much of it within the Department of Environmental Conservation for work around infrastructure projects, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater projects, brownfields remediation. But there's also been state one-time money that's been made available and has flowed into other parts of this agency, allowing us to make investments in state lands, in wetland restoration and protection, and it's updating our forest action plan. I know all of which are likely to be of interest to this committee. So it is a time of sort of great opportunity, but also a significant challenge just because of the persistent high workload that are confronting our staff. And so we continue to work through that. I am an optimist by nature and really focus on the opportunity that this funding presents to make the kinds of investments in important environmental infrastructure and natural resources that we simply have probably in a lifetime. But it is a challenge all the same. And so just want to honor and acknowledge that. In addition to the sort of the funding component, there's some really significant books of work that this agency has been tasked with and is frankly leading on. The two I would flag remain climate action, and can talk a little bit more about that, as well as Act 59, which is the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 conservation bill. And may actually leave it to John or Chris to talk a little bit more details about that. In terms of climate action, obviously the flooding this summer really, I think, brought increased emphasis to the importance of resilience in addition to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. I would say that is a set of issues and concerns that the agency has repeatedly raised, that climate change is happening already. And so this idea that greenhouse gas emissions reductions doesn't need to go hand in glove with efforts around resilience is an inaccurate assessment. And frankly, I've been a bit surprised by the legislature's lack of interest, honestly, in resilience, but that's changed. And there is dozens, literally, of bills in front of the legislature this year with different proposals related to resilience, including things looking at riparian corridors, wetland protection and conservation, flood resilience. There are several bills that would speak to dredging of streams and rivers. So it sort of runs the full gamut of what you would imagine would be people's responses in light of the flooding this summer. The agency has been actively testifying both about the work we have underway. A lot of our clean water work looks a lot like resilience work in terms of river corridor protection and floodplain restoration and wetland conservation. And then also speaking against some of the bills that purport things like dredging as a solution to some of the flooding south of summer. So happy to speak to any bills if folks have specific questions, but just know that this is an area that we're actively involved in the legislature. And then also, as you may have heard, the governor and the treasurer jointly announced maybe 2 weeks ago now that they'll be collaborating on a resilience implementation strategy. And that will be largely staffed by folks in the Climate Action Office here at ANR. The intention of the resilience implementation strategy is to gather good work that's all related to resilience that doesn't necessarily tie together just yet. Things like our tactical basin plans, our watershed plans, our river corridor plans, the inventory we've done of wetland restoration work, some of our long range management plans, and start to bring all of that information together in order to be able to articulate some clear priorities around resilience. I think that generally folks have a sense of the types of projects that are needed, but that ability to prioritize them is going to be really critical in the years ahead. The intention there is to have that resilience implementation strategy drafted by July 1st of next year. And that is timed to align with when the Climate Council will be issuing its revised climate action plan for the state. And so knowing that climate action plan really spends most of its energy and effort around greenhouse gas emissions, to have those two documents merged simultaneously will also hopefully help ensure that both remain part of the conversation going forward. Before maybe flipping it over to Commissioner Herrick or John to talk about Act 59, but also just flag there is a bill specific to endangered species law that was introduced into the House Environment and Energy Committee. It came as a complete surprise to us. It wasn't something that the agency had engaged on. And I'm going to meet with the bill's sponsor later this week because I'm at a loss as to exactly what his goals were in introducing this legislation. So happy to report back to this group at some point, but we just don't have a lot of insight into what we're seeing as the gaps. And frankly, I think it in some ways ignores the existence of this body and the species advisory group and the advisory groups and the role you play in bringing listing recommendations to us. So in part, I want to just make sure he's got eyes into the work of the Endangered Species Committee, and then see if their needs that he believes persist with benefit of that information and figure out maybe some possible steps. So we'll report back, but just know that bill came as much a surprise to us as I suspect it probably came to many.
Just a little bit about what they're trying to accomplish and who the he is.
So it's Representative Sakowitz, although I think almost every member of the House Environment and Energy Committee signed on to the bill. And we're happy to circulate the text or link to it.
I'll go have Abigail put copies together.
Oh, okay, that'd be great, Chris. Thank you. So it has a couple of different components. One is it creates a mandatory every 3 years update to the listing of species, which is part of what it felt like is sort of incongruous with how we do our work, where it's as recommendations come in. Sometimes we sort of right and do one rulemaking process, but it's not time bound in that way, which felt a little weird and awkward. It requires us to establish critical habitat for all listed species in the state, which I think is also both a significant undertaking and a potentially challenging book of work. And then some of the other pieces I thought were, which are escaping me right now. There was at least one other critical component. I don't know, John or Rose. Those were the two that felt like we need some dialogue around what the intention was, and in some ways what the gap feels like is that isn't being addressed right now.
Didn't it only allow takings for
Oh.
enhancement of the population?
Correct, that was another piece. So it also will no longer allow scientific takings, and it also will allow occasionally with the president, we or the agency, if we come into possession of an endangered species that has important traditional purposes for some of our indigenous community members, will provide them with feathers or other body parts, and it would prevent us from doing that. And so a couple of those things are real, again, questions in terms of what the concern is that is endeavoring to be addressed through the bill. 812.
812, and I'll have copies for you in a little bit.
I could email them all. So
And so the committee did an initial walkthrough of the bill, but hasn't taken testimony on it yet, but certainly just wanted to flag it for this group. And that I think it merits attention and would benefit from some of your expertise and input in terms of our process and sort of how this either lines up or in my mind sort of grinds against a little bit of what we're doing.
You said, Secretary, it seems like more a reflection of just that person in that committee not understanding the existing authority and the processes that are in place to list and recover endangered species. So
I think it's well intentioned.
yes.
yeah,
Maybe as much an opportunity for us
That's what I was
to
gonna say.
educate them. Good work that goes on as a result of this committee and species advisory groups and our expertise.
Well, if, I mean, in conversations, you want me to speak to the committee or, you know, if they are looking for someone for testimony, let me know. So,
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will absolutely make that suggestion to Representative Sekowitz.
Yeah.
Are there questions about any of that?
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I had a couple comments and maybe a question for the secretary. I recently was brought to my attention the Worcester Range Management Plan. And maybe you saw that article that John Dillon had written. Couple comments about that. It doesn't seem to follow the recommendations of the Vermont Conservation Design, specifically talking about the 9% old growth target is not even mentioned in the draft. The other thing that seems to be lacking is Act 59, which calls for ecological preserve areas left unmanaged in perpetuity. The draft plan doesn't follow that rule, doesn't seem to mention anything about protecting high priority natural areas and maintaining or restoring old growth forests. And so I guess the question is would the Agency of Natural Resources consider changing this management plan to reflect the goals of both the Vermont Conservation Design and Act 59 and set aside significant portions of the low and middle elevation forests in the Worcester Range Management Area as ecological reserves? And I think as a member of this committee, we're constantly, seeing new species coming up that have to be listed. And it seems like we have an opportunity here to, particularly in the northern hardwood forest portion of this block, which I think approaches like 4,000 acres, is pretty significant, to set this aside as an old growth forest reserve. We really have a long way to go to get to that 9% number. And I'm just wondering why this seems to not be a priority for this really significant block of forest in the state. I think we're talking about 18,000 acres or something like that. It's a pretty big piece, and it's in pretty good shape at this point. So
maybe I will start and then turn it over to John, who can help answer your questions in more detail, Paul.
yeah,
I guess I would say I see the long range management plan as proposed as largely consistent with both Vermont Conservation Design and Act 59. And certainly those were considerations as the district stewardship team that includes representatives from Fish and Wildlife, FPR, and DEC worked to assemble that long range management plan. We look at both sort of the particular block or unit when we're developing a long range management plan, as well as the state's land holdings writ large. And this is an 18,000 acre tract of 360,000 acres of land that we own in fee. And so are balancing all of the various interests and uses of different pieces of land kind of across that much larger portfolio of public lands that we steward. And I don't know, John, if you would add more specifics to that.
Well, sure, I'm happy to. I agree with you, Secretary Moore. So the plan was developed, in fact, very much to align with the interests and principles of Vermont conservation design. I mean, Vermont conservation design was spearheaded by the Fish and Wildlife Department and the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation for a variety of purposes, not the least of which was to guide our land conservation and our land stewardship, that is public land management. So that's baked into every plan that we develop and every decision that we make about how to manage and treat state lands. In terms of the degree to which the proposed long-range management plan for the Worcester Management Unit comports with the interests and principles of Act 59, as Secretary Moore said, it very much does. But the development of that plan long predates even the idea of Act 59, which I would argue is part of the good intentions behind it. The Worcester Range Management Unit and all of the public lands that have been conserved that now make up that unit of remarkably healthy, intact, conserved lands is a reflection of the interests of this agency to conserve important lands for ecological purposes and for social purposes. And in this case, in a really unique part of the state, in north central Vermont, where it's proximal to Burlington, the state capital, it serves a lot of needs and interests for a lot of people. This was all done very intentionally. This is not a reflection of an accident or just opportunities of the moment. This conservation effort that is the Worcester Range Management Unit has been a project long in the making. And in fact, working with our partners at the Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land, we greatly expanded that footprint of state conserved lands in the Worcester Range Management Unit within the last 10 years. So very intentional on the part of the agency to conserve those lands and to develop a management plan that tries to deal with all of our interests and responsibilities. In terms of the old forest and ecological reserve interests that are reflected in Act 59, Act 59 very wisely lays out a charge for the agency to figure out the extent to which we're going to be able to incorporate the concept of ecological reserves and the contribution that they can make to the development of old forest over time on state lands. It's not prescriptive in that regard. It doesn't set a target. It just asks us to figure out how can we more directly and intentionally incorporate that principle and those interests into our state lands planning and management. We've actually been doing that, contrary to popular opinion, for a really long time, albeit without a clear process to guide that. But we have areas that are in effect ecological reserves throughout the state on state land. Some of them are in the form of natural areas, some of them are in the form of fragile areas. Those are all special designations that go through a governor approval process. Some of them are in the form of what we characterize as highly sensitive management areas on state lands. And although those areas don't necessarily carry the same level of permanence that a natural area designation does, for instance, or a conservation easement on state land that may try to advance the purposes of old forest development, it still expresses an intention on the part of the agency to manage areas of state land for certain ecological purposes. And in some cases, it's to develop old forest. Bill Sladek Wildlife Management Area is a great example of that. So in terms of the criticism that the proposed plan doesn't address the interests that we expressed for old forest targets in Vermont, I respectfully disagree. We've actually significantly expanded the proposed natural area in the Worcester Management Unit. I don't remember the figures off the top of my head, but I want to say that we've effectively doubled it. There's other areas that have been designated as highly sensitive management areas, which are going to be managed in a certain way. So what the plan has proposed for active management over the course of the next 20 years is 1,900 acres of the 18 or so thousand acres of the Worcester Management Unit, less than 10%. And maybe I've been around too long, but I can think that if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, it would be 180 degrees reversed. We typically would be lining up to get kicked in the shins for not being aggressive enough with our active forest management. In this instance, what the stewardship team has proposed for active forest management on that large unit is really designed with an eye towards climate resilience. As Allie well knows, because Allie, you probably had a voice in this somewhere along the way. All of the active management areas are either intended to build resilience for flooding events, for climate change, and to enhance habitat for various types of wildlife for very specific purposes in very specific areas. And then otherwise, frankly, one of the greatest challenges that we have in looking to the future of the health and integrity of what I would argue is one of the most unique areas of state land that we have, given where it sits in the state relative to Burlington, Montpelier, a lot of population centers. This area is relatively undeveloped in terms of outdoor recreation infrastructure. And compared to Mount Mansfield State Forest and Camel's Hump State Forest, which supports a great deal of outdoor recreation infrastructure, this area does not. And so this is one area where you can get off trail and go out there and get lost in some pretty wild areas. I mean, that's part of the agency's interests in trying to maintain that character during a time when there's a lot of people who want more and more access to areas of state land. That's the real challenge with this one. Sorry, I probably went on a little too long, but I'm quite passionate about the process, about the opportunities, and about this area of land. I don't know, Paul, if that was helpful to get at your questions.
Yeah, no, I think it was helpful. I think there's a couple things you mentioned, though. There's still this 9% target that the Vermont Conservation Design, and I don't see where that's going with this project. And the other point I want to make is that almost by default, a good portion of this parcel is going to be protected anyway, because so much of it is high elevation. So I think we're really talking about is looking at some of these lowland, the hardwood forests that represents a smaller portion, and that's the part that's going to be actively managed. And I think that's where the criticism comes. And I think if we want to try to, hit that target of 9%, we want to be looking at a broad spectrum of forest types, not just the high elevation areas that are going to be protected by default anyway. So that's I think where the criticism comes from, and there are multiple people that seem to be wondering what where's the 9% going to come from. So anyway, but thanks for your input. I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate you bringing me back to that question, Paul. So the 9% is a statewide target. It's not intended to be applied in one particular region or on any particular pieces of property. I think the goal of 9% is going to have to be something that's done over a longer period of time, taking into consideration where you can do it on use value appraisal properties, where you can do it on federal properties, where you can do it on state lands properties. So it's not a try to find the solution on a small set of state ownerships. It's got to be something bigger than that. I guess I would go back and say I still feel as though we have taken that into consideration in the development of the plan by expanding the areas that would be under the natural area designation. And maybe we need to figure out how we have tried to characterize these interests in the plan itself, because such a small portion of this large area is being considered for active management. The interests that are expressed in some of the highly sensitive management units perhaps get at some of the concerns that are being expressed about old forest. And using this as an opportunity to try and expand on that interest.
All right, thanks.
You have to run.
I've been keeping track just because my ride isn't here yet, but I should
Okay.
probably go.
All right. Well, thank you, Secretary Moore. Appreciate your time. Yep.
Always appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you.
All right. I'll turn it over to
Okay.
Chris and John.
So on the same theme of legislative initiatives, there's one that kind of tangentially touches you all. And that is an effort in the Senate, S-258, which does two things. The first part is the one that is of interest to you primarily, is that it would reorganize the Fish and Wildlife Board. Now, the board currently, if you don't know, has 14 members, one from each county, appointed by the governor. And their focus and their scope is to develop rules and regulations around hunting and fishing and trapping, which have already, for activities already that the legislature have made legal. The bill changes the entire makeup. It reduces it from 14 to 12. The appointments, 8 of them would come from the legislature and 4 from me. But the scope and the authority of the board is changed to make it advisory. But it expands it to include non-game activities. That's where I think if you had a Venn diagram, you'd see an intersection with your roles and responsibility. And so I think it would create confusion. This group works very well, has for a very long time. And so I'm very concerned about that it would cause a conflict of who has what roles as we move forward. Is that a fair way to explain that, John? So that's S-258. I'm going to have this conversation with the sponsor of the bill, Senator Bray from Madison County, among other reasons that we're very concerned about this, not the least of which is that we're reducing the number of representatives from 14 to 12. John, do you want to touch on Act 59? That we had that report yesterday at our meeting. Do you want to just give those highlights? I think you're better prepared to speak to that than I am.
Sure. Well, we just talked about it a little bit.
Yep.
Relative to the Worcester Range Long Range Management Plan, and Roz, you're engaged, so please fill in, and Ally and others who have been part of any of this. Act 59, it was passed last legislative session. It's known as the Vermont Biodiversity Law. And so it sets out a vision for the conservation of Vermont's biodiversity, and it tries to achieve this broad vision through some ambitious goals. One being the permanent conservation of 30% of the landscape of Vermont by 2030, and the conservation of 50% of the Vermont landscape by 2050. It does the 50% a little bit differently than it does the 30%. The 30% is envisioned to be permanent conservation. That is through acquisition or easements. 50% is envisioned to be a combination of that in addition to what has been characterized as other durable forms of conservation. I would equate that to like lands enrolled in the use value appraisal program, for instance. Before I go on, I see Brian has his hand up.
Well, sorry, John, it's not about this. It's for the commissioner on the on S-258. So I'll hold my question though.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So it has these two goals: 30 by 30, 50 by 50. It requires the law requires the Agency of Natural Resources, in partnership with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, to do an assessment of conserved lands today and figure out well, where are we at? What is the percent of the landscape that's already conserved that is contributing to biodiversity conservation? So not all of the lands that are conserved in the state necessarily contribute to the vision of the law. The law also creates these 3 land conservation categories: ecological reserves, biodiversity reserves, and natural resource management areas. So this 2-phased approach to implementing the law is we go through an assessment process of all conserved lands to figure out, of the lands that are already conserved in Vermont, how close are we to that 30%? And of those lands, which categories do they fit into? And then after we've done this assessment, and we have to take into consideration things like how do agricultural lands fit into this? Roz is part of a working group dealing with that question. The main part is really the conservation categories and figuring out how are we going to analyze all of the types of conserved lands to figure out where they fit into the various categories. So there's a working group that's dealing with that right now. There's a working group dealing with how will state-owned lands contribute to ecological reserve. So we're dealing with that, trying to come up with a process, criteria to make decisions around that. There's all these technical issues that need to be sorted out. That's what's happening now, and that's supposed to be completed by July 1st of this year. And there's still a lot of work to do. After that, we start with the development of the plan that will ultimately guide the direction of the vision of the law, that is the conservation of Vermont's biodiversity, and how we're going to achieve those goals. And just as an aside, I like to try and remind people when we're talking about Act 59 that it's about biodiversity conservation more than it's about 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. The beauty of that law is the vision and the principles behind it, in my opinion, more than the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 goals themselves. So helpful to remind ourselves of that, because I just worry sometimes that people will have a tendency to race to the goal at the expense of the purpose. So maybe we can talk more about that another time, but so then we got to develop a plan. The plan has to be done or presented to the legislature by December 31st, 2025, if I remember correctly. So we're basically a year and a half to put the plan together. So we haven't really embarked on that yet. And the law itself lays out a very elaborate process for public engagement. We had a lot of public engagement in this process. There already is a lot of public engagement in the process. So Vermont Housing Conservation Board is coordinating the assessment effort right now in partnership with our agency. There's a lot of other organizations and interests that are at the table being part of this planning effort. And we're starting to make progress. It was a bit of a slow launch. Vermont Housing and Conservation Board hired a consulting firm to help coordinate this effort. And it's complicated. There's a lot to it, a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So it was a bit of a funky launch, but we're now moving forward and making some good progress. Roz, what did I miss?
I would just say that this is just a really great opportunity to get biodiversity further higher up in everyone's consciousness. And this is a huge planning effort that we've never seen the likes of. And it's at the same time that our state wildlife action plan is getting rolling. So, and then we have VCD and the new update with it. So there's a lot of, and then all the climate action stuff. So there's a lot happening right now that I think will help elevate the importance and actually the prioritization of biodiversity in the state in all these different ways. But John, you spoke fine to everything going on with this, with delivering Act 59. It's going to be a race to the finish, and it's going to be a challenge to fulfill it in terms of how much it's going to require we ramp up conservation efforts and where those resources are going to come from. So it won't be easy, but I'm thrilled that this effort is happening to actually proactively try to make the landscape more resilient through VCD, through biodiversity. So there's a lot of things, a lot of ways that it connects to a lot of what we're doing, including everything this committee does.
Chime in and say, please reach out to the SAGs and this body if there's any role we can support. I mean, we don't do this because we want to further that mission, not just focus on permitting issues for individual species and all that stuff that we get, myopically focused on. It'd be great if, and I'm sure, speaking for Laura SAG, many of our members would be glad.
Yeah, I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for that. It's early in the process where we're just defining terms and such. But how, SGCN might come into play, that's yet to be determined.
Yeah, I was gonna say this runs about parallel to the whole WAC process, right? Wildlife Action Plan.
Time-wise, yeah.
Yeah. Will there be some coming together, or do we are yet to know that process?
Well, we have our.
Yeah. Well, before we do that, I mean, I think Brian had a question. I have to leave at some point too, so. But we definitely should talk about that intersection. I see John Cart's in here, so. Brian?
Well, other than just mentioning that this great confluence of planning efforts, probably means that Roz and many of us will be sitting before computer screens and looking at GIS instead of out in the field. Sorry about that. But just the question I have for the commissioner about that bill about S258. I have to confess, I haven't really followed that. But I'm kind of wondering, given that the board, that model is the model that you've been working under for a long time, and assuming that you support that model, I'm kind of wondering if you feel there are any intrinsic practical conflicts between that duty, that responsibility, that model, and the work of this committee, the work to protect rare, threatened, and endangered species. And whether you think that there might be ways to ameliorate any of those conflicts, if you think that there are some.
As it's currently constituted?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I think their scope is so narrow that they don't intrude on the work that you do. If you have an example, I mean, we certainly can discuss, but I can't think of an instance. Can you, John? Roz?
Oh, I mean, for me, maybe it's a function of just being biased because I've lived with it for so long. But I mean, this committee serves a very important, well-defined role, and the Fish and Wildlife Board serves a very important, well-defined role. And maybe there's merit in trying to figure out how one could complement the other. But I think part of the beauty of it is at least you're not bumping into each other.
Yeah.
And you're able to remain focused on the important responsibilities that you have without complicating the work of different bodies. But
I think as it's written, there would be conflict.
As the bill is written?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that I understand. Yeah.
Okay. But as it
I don't know that I could come up. I don't know that I could come up with examples either. I just haven't thought about it enough.
Brian, I can only give you, 3 years of experience with the board and the issues that have come forward to it. And none of them even come close. I mean, we're talking about next month. There's a petition on whether we should allow the use of drones to locate deer that have been wounded. That is not an atypical issue. That's kind of run-of-the-mill kind of stuff. Approving the waterfowl season, giving a report on the deer harvest, that kind of stuff. So I don't think it even gets close to touching.
I guess it would be. I don't know, I guess it would come into play when there were land management decisions that came under the purview of the board. More
They
obviously.
they don't address those.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the one that I was going to bring up is, what the reptile and amphibian SAG has brought up on, seasons or taking limits. And it hasn't so much been endangered species, but it's been essentially non-regulated herp populations. And, when you were saying all non-game would fall under the purview of this new committee, there would be sort of a situation where, I don't know, maybe not conflict, but like you say, bumping into each other.
And we are putting, there is a bill in to look at the herp trade specifically that you should take a look at. We're really concerned about that. But so, like I said, as it stands now, they don't touch, there's no intersection. But as it's written, there absolutely would be, and I think it would cause confusion among the two boards and also among the general public.
I think I'm old enough to remember when there was a conflict going on between the legislature and Fish and Wildlife that initially gave the non-game board the ability to make the final decision as opposed to be just advisory. How it initially evolved that you guys as the department lost the decision-making ability for setting seasons, and it was handed off to the board.
So here's what
deer season.
It was deer season,
Yeah.
and John will correct me if I'm wrong. The legislature used to set all the deer seasons and regulations,
Yeah.
and they realized they didn't want to have that because everybody in the state of Vermont is a herd expert. Let me tell you, because I hear from each and every one of them. And so they created the board. But functionally, the board gets their recommendations from the department. And so when it comes to the moose and the deer regulation, it's Nick Fortin, who you may not know, but he's the large mammal biologist. And I have yet to see, I mean, they have questions, they want to understand. But that's the history of it because they punted. And so that was back in the 70s. Is that right, John?
Certainly in the 70s, I can't, yes, it was in the 70s, because in the 80s, the change had already taken place.
So if the board became advisory, the decision-making ability itself would be back to the legislature or back to you?
To me.
To you. Okay. So essentially then it would have gone from legislature to board.
To me.
To the commission.
Right.
Just, it does seem philosophically that it should be your department that makes those decisions as opposed to either the legislature or the board.
Well, I think that's a good discussion to have, and I'm not sure this is the forum, but I'll talk to anybody anytime. But here's what I will say. Practically speaking, the board votes on the recommendations that come from the commissioner. Yeah. And 99.9% of the time they go, yeah, we should probably listen to the people whose job it is to manage wildlife. The concern that I have with this new construct is it mandates folks who are not involved in hunting, trapping, or fishing on the board. And while it's advisory, there's a separation of powers issue as well. Because currently the legislature makes the laws, the executive branch makes the rules. It's the Fish and Wildlife Board, but now the appointments, 8 of them would come from the legislature. That's a separation of powers problem. And that's also a concern. But practically speaking, the system as it currently is set up works because the board has great questions, but they ask, and they ask them, but they listen to the experts, whether it's Nick, or John, or David Sawsville, or Bree Furphy, our fur bearer biologist, because they trust and believe in the wildlife management that the department is tasked with.
There are other details in that bill too that concern me when it comes
Go
to
ahead.
the interest of this group, which some of it's more details in what they propose, which is, like the commissioner said, 8 would be appointed by legislature. And it doesn't lay out very good sort of qualifications for who could be appointed. There's no scientific advisory group process for the kinds of things that we're concerned with here. There's just a lot. I feel like it would lower the bar significantly on sort of the quality of input we get through the process that we have. So I see a lot of problems.
And I'll be
with running this
frank,
committee.
it's completely political. And that's what concerns me. Is who is going to want to have an interest in being on that board and why.
Yeah, I was gonna maybe ask a question of that. And I guess mostly, this is sort of maybe naive on my part, but just kind of thinking, okay, opportunity to kind of talk with legislators about, the challenges here, but still, kind of dealing with the political aspect of it or the public aspect of it about, how do you move this conversation forward in such a way that actually addresses the concern of the groups that are bringing this to the forefront?
Well, and I can tell you, I actually think we've done a very good job as a department, and take the rulemaking that we just went through. I created working groups that involved a diverse representative group. It had people who are absolutely opposed to anything to do with trapping. It says so in their formation document. And I brought in trappers and everyone in between. And we had staff like Chris Saunders and Kim Royer facilitate 4 different meetings to try to get to a consensus. And so I think it's important to note that I listen to everybody. But as I've said in committee, and I've said a number of, anybody who has kids will say, yeah, I listen to my kids, but do you do everything they tell you to do? No, you don't. We as a department are required to follow the science. And while we do acknowledge the social dynamics are also a science, and so that does influence a lot of our decision making. I would say that we are better now than we've ever been at listening to all opinions. And so I think re-engineering the board is not the answer.
Yeah, Brian.
Well, since I brought it up and since we've got a little bit more time on the agenda, and not to put Matt or Carla or maybe Allie on the spot, but it did occur to me that, for example, there may be cases where we, when some WMUs, like we might want to shoot more deer, that there may in fact be, that's a possible actual conflict, or certainly a way to collaborate. And I don't know if they have an opinion on that.
You're thinking in terms of deer overpopulation, consuming the rare plants and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know enough about the inner workings of the wildlife board and the process for setting the quotas for the different WMUs to sort of know if that, my general perception as a deer hunter as well is that the parts of the state that have higher quotas, the limitation on the harvest isn't necessarily the quotas. It's getting the hunters to the right piece of land where they can actually get deer and things like that. So, yeah. You bring up an interesting intersection, though.
I can say that it's something we've talked about, though. Nick does take that into consideration. And I also will tell you the biggest hurdle that we have to management of the deer herd is posting of land. And so, so for instance, I live in Grand Isle. We have way too many deer in Grand Isle. Despite that fact, I shot none. But I'm not allowed to because I'm the commissioner. But they're all dancing in my yard now. But we issued statewide 19,000 antlerless permits for muzzleloader to try to draw the population down, and it didn't have the effect. And so I think it's passively intersectional, but I don't think we're at odds with each other either. And so I think that's kind of a differentiation. But I mean, everybody's welcome to come to the deer meetings too that we have. They're coming up in March. And certainly anytime you want to talk about those kind of issues, we bring them to the board. So.
Interesting point though.
Yeah.
Brian, I mean, maybe that's one example of an opportunity where we can look for like this complementary marriage of interests between what our scientists do, what the board does, and what this committee does through the species advisory group. So like Nick could go have a conversation with the Flora Species Advisory Group just to make sure that we haven't missed something in considering how to manage within deer populations within certain WMUs. I like that idea. He thinks about it a lot, and as you might imagine, he gets calls from landowners and foresters and everybody who's got an opinion about the effect of deer on forest health and regeneration. But as you say, Commissioner, some areas where that's a problem, you're spot on that, is we can't give enough antlerless permits away in some of those areas. So there just aren't enough people interested in hunting, nor do they have access to enough land to actually bring those deer densities down to where we would like them to be. That's the real challenge.
I wish I could say that when I was a deer hunter, I did my share, but I didn't because I was a lousy.
Did you buy your license?
What's that?
Did you buy a license?
I did. I had a yeah, I did. I
You
used to be a licensed deer hunter. Yeah.
You did your
I
share.
sucked at it.
Did you have another?
Yeah,
Brian
I would-
admitting to poaching online.
Yeah.
Sorry, Carla.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to thank Brian for inviting comments from others, and my silence or passivity is kind of echoing what Matt just said. I don't have a sufficient working knowledge of the board, and so was just sort of enjoying listening to the conversation. But as the conversation was unfolding, I was also sort of wondering, well, if I'm sitting here with the curiosity of, what's the nuts and bolts and how does it really work within the board? I wonder if there are board members or participants in that process that also have a blank spot in thinking about the ESC and or the scientific advisory group. So, whatever cross-pollination can happen there in terms of participation or listening in or updates and reports is a good idea to me.
We'll look at an idea on how to kind of share that information back and forth, but we'll follow up also with Nick on this particular suggestion. But I get the broader context as well. I think Jim had a question.
Yeah, I was just following up on, or was thinking about following up on something that Alan had said. I mean, we had the Reptile Amphibian Scientific Advisory Group project forward two concerns. One was about the pond slider and potentially becoming invasive and controlling pets so that we don't introduce invasive species that way. The other one may bring about was trying to provide protection for non-game species that currently don't have it, like the non-migratory. I mean, with a bird, you get the Migratory Bird Act, and so with a turtle or a snake, I mean, currently we've talked about how gray the regulations are. I mean, essentially, you can go out and whack them, and nobody's really gonna nobody's really going to follow up on that. So I have seen a draft of legislation that starts addressing that. And so what that would do, at least based on the draft that I've seen, would move a non-game species essentially to a game species like snapping turtle. All of a sudden become a game species, in that there would be an allowed season and a bag limit. So I guess in my mind, that makes it game. Right? And so, I mean, that wasn't necessarily the intent of our bringing forward that concern. We brought forward the concern to try to protect, non-game species. But I mean, the way it was interpreted was, well, let's try to maintain some of the traditional uses, which were bullfrogs for frogs' legs and snapping turtles for meat. And so the idea was, let's try to maintain that, maybe create some sort of limited season for those two. So I guess all I'm getting at is it would be nice to have people on the board who have an interest in and knowledge of conservation of some of these non-traditional groups of species, because they will come under their purview in the future, or they may if this bill indeed becomes law.
Roz, maybe you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens with the bill. It's right now, it would be bullfrogs and green frogs, snapping turtles. We still, this bill doesn't address the harvest piece. But so that would have to be in rulemaking after the fact. And that would be a good time to have this discussion and figure out how that would all look.
It looks like this bill is setting the stage.
Yes,
for that next
exactly.
piece.
Yep.
But the primary purpose of the bill, as you pointed out, Jim, is to create legal authority to restrict the possession and collection of the animals that you're referring to. That's what we're trying to achieve with looking beyond that, as you say, Roz, is how do we deal with those other interests that you just mentioned?
And the
bullfrogs for frog legs and maybe snapping turtles, but I think that needs to be a conversation with the Herb SAG and Roz and Luke.
Yeah, I'd love to be a part of those kind of conversations. But my point really is just that in the future, it may be that some more species are going to come under the purview.
So let's just use that one as an example, and I'll tell you how the nitty gritty of this works, and then I'm already way behind, so I'm sorry. If we were getting to rulemaking about snapping turtle, the recommendation that goes to the board comes from me. Well, I'm not going to make that in a vacuum. I would come and talk with you. I would have Roz and John talk with you and say, here's what we're looking at for a rule, and tidy it up. And then it would go from me to the board. They may have questions, and it would be great for the experts to come to the board meeting to say why we're moving in this and support the department. And we'd have Luke there as well. And then the board would say, oh, all right, well, that'll make sense, and probably just vote. And so that's where we would ensure that you have the input that's required and needed to make a solid recommendation.
I guess just to add to that, Commissioner, and that assumes that the rulemaking would have to go through the Fish and Wildlife Board versus you exercising potentially your own commission ruling.
Correct. And either way, the early stages of that process wouldn't change in my mind. I do have to run. I leave you in the able hands of Roz, John, and John. Thank you for all your
helpful. Thank you, Commissioner.
No, thanks for the questions. And if you have any other questions, feel free to drop me an email or give me a call. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.
All right, thanks.
And that's H597, by the way. That bill.
Probably we're trying to package a few things, or I shouldn't say you, whoever put the draft together, trying to package a few goals into that one bill. There are things other than reptiles and amphibians involved in that.
Well, the additions were reptiles, amphibians, but there's a lot in there that was already there that it's adding on to.
Yeah.
Maybe
like
included
about
those-
feral swine and such. That's all. That was already in there. So this is amending a bill. Or
Oh,
amending, yeah.
That was already existing.
Yeah, so
Right.
I can send around the copy. Anything that's underlined is what's changed, but there's a lot of old
So
stuff in there.
Feral swine bill.
Yeah.
I always think of them together.
I think it also has, includes a restricted sale.
Yeah, I noticed a couple things. It seemed like an odd combination, but
Yeah.
I know how that happens.
But the primary interest is the restriction on the collection and possession of reptiles. and amphibians. And we're hoping that that is an opportunity for Roz and Lou to get in front of that committee, and maybe yourself as well, Jim.
Have to.
To educate them on not just why the bill is important, but let's use it as an opportunity to educate them on all things herb conservation related. And the big challenges that are in front of us and the important work that all of us are doing to advance that.
Can I make some quick comments right now?
Yeah, make it quick. I don't want to get behind too, yeah.
When I heard the reason the green frogs were included was not because they were traditionally collected or included in the thinking about the future. It's not because they're traditionally collected, but because people would have a hard time telling them from bullfrogs.
Right.
But at the same time, we expect people to tell a black duck from a mallard, right? So let's teach people how to tell these things apart, and there's no reason to have each of them a bullfrog. And the second thing I would mention is that I think it's unwise. There's a whole different direction. I think it's unwise to eat snapping turtles. They are very tolerant of polluted water, and they biocollect anything that's in the water for 40 years. And if anybody ever tested snapping turtle, or they ate it, and I'm sure these people don't, whoever it is that's eating snapping turtles, but if they did, I think they'd find it unwise to eat snapping turtles.
There's a good reason not to include it. I appreciate it.
Unwise going near snake.
Yeah. Matt.
And just throw in, well, we're sort of on the topic of, I guess, cross-pollination of different boards and so forth. I'll just throw out one flora-related issue, and this isn't particularly a high concern for us, but right now, ginseng, which is considered a globally vulnerable, although state uncommon level species, is permitted for harvest through Agency of Ag, and there, to my knowledge, there's certainly been no interchange anywhere in the years that I've been involved with the Flora Scientific Advisory Group. Like, we don't hear anything about, how much is harvested, or let alone be consulted as to any sort of thresholds on what should be harvested. It's just a place where there seems like there's a total disconnect.
Stephanie from the Agency of Agriculture. So we could give you totals. I mean, we report our totals to US Fish and Wildlife. And we could provide that information to this group if you'd like. Certainly on ginseng collection, we do permit collectors and dealers. In order for them to sell out of state, they have to be permitted by the agency. For dealers specifically, and those that collect, people that collect have to collect on their own property unless they have the permission of the property owner. And then we also have ginseng rules that outline what can be collected and based on age limits. And then when through the certification process, we make sure that indeed it meets that requirement. And if it doesn't, then we take it, we actually hand it, I think, over to Fish and Wildlife. And then that gets audited on state lands. It's my understanding is how that works. Savannah, no? I know, but for some reason I feel like, all right, never mind. But we can certainly kind of talk about that if the committee is interested in that information. And I can certainly share a link to the rules. We've considered revising the rules, but we haven't. So we're currently revising the noxious weed rule. So we're going through that process.
And maybe it's more sharing with the Flora Advisory,
Okay.
Scientific Advisory Group rather
Yep.
than the whole. ESC.
That's fine. Yeah.
But yeah, it just seems like it would be great for there to be some information flow and opportunity for input from, or even for us as we think about, we're constantly thinking about ranking and rarity levels of things. It's a data point for us, what the harvest
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
like, and we don't-
Yeah. Yeah, we have that data going back a very long time, actually. Yeah, we might even. Anyway, yes, happy to share.
It would just be great if there could be interchange that's sort of the regulated or the regulator and then the folks that have more of the specific knowledge. And
Yes.
it's kind of not the usual ballpark for ag.
Well, I don't know where you're at on the agenda, and I don't want to disrupt the timing. I know Roz had some other updates to offer if there's time, but I also just want to offer my perspective on our respective roles. I have a lot to learn in this new position, and am following Roz's lead and the lead of others who are much more knowledgeable on the process and the issues. So moving forward, I'm envisioning that you'll hear more in terms of updates and issues from Roz with me filling in the gaps versus the other way around.
Ross, how do you feel about that?
I am no John Austin, but I'll just have to try to be.
I would say, what were you thinking of updates on? What else was on your list?
Actually, some of it, the airport would be one, but we can talk
Mhm.
about that when Mark gives
Okay.
his update. And a quick one on all things RAWA,
Mhm,
which, and John might have, and then swap at some point,
mhm. Okay.
which John can also help with or
Mhm.
do
Okay.
in tandem. So
Okay.
whenever you want to get to those
Okay. Yeah.
and whatever the interests of the committee might be.
Yeah. I guess what I'll say, and I don't know, maybe we pull it all together under John's time at the end, if that makes some sense. I mean, we were thinking about the April meeting kind of being an opportunity to talk about Vermont conservation design and interactions with Act 59 and how those come together. And also thinking about just having Fish and Wildlife staff go around to the SAGs and continue to help, get input from each of the SAGs in terms of thinking about, new directions for VCD and how SAGs can interact. Obviously, with the Wildlife Action Plan up for renewal, they do all kind of come to a confluence there. So
And
yeah.
Jill Kilborn has reached out to me to start that process as
Mhm.
far as the wildlife.
Yeah,
action
yeah,
and the recent
yeah.
Discussion.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'd say let's move on with the agenda. We can get back to Franklin County Airport during the bird SAG, and we can get to RAWA and, well, no, why don't you do RAWA now, and then we'll do Wildlife Action Plan with John.
Okay. Well, RAWA is so the AFWA folks are still lobbying, still pushing for it. But in the meantime, there's a Republican from Arkansas has also introduced alt RAWA bill. And it's called the America's Wildlife Habitat Conservation Act, but it's really different from RAWA. And I think AFWA is kind of just watching to see what happens. They don't want to get competitive about it. And they're in support of the idea of it, which is it does end up with increasing funding. But it's through from currently our funding is 56 million a year nationwide for the SWIGs. And this would increase to 300 million a year. And it would be on a 5-year renewable path. So there's a lot more details, but it's just being introduced now. And I haven't even seen it. I don't know if it's even out, John, but we'll see what happens, but they're kind of playing it. Let's see what happens. There still needs to be what they call a way to pay for either of these. And that continues to be a pretty big barrier because you can come up with great ideas for funding those and then somebody steals them for a higher priority bill. And also, you know, we all know sort of what Congress looks like these days, and so there's that factor in terms of getting something done. So, so there's not a lot to report, but we're just kind of keeping an eye on it.
I think maybe another week or two, the bill is out.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet.
Big questions. The key thing is that Congressman who's introduced it is the head of the House Natural.
Yeah, and it gives different allocations to states. It's different formula for how much a state gets that may benefit us. Hard to say, but it's just too early to even go down that road and spend too much time on it.
All right, well, thanks everyone for those updates. It is you, Stephanie.
Oh, well, Stephanie Smith, yes. I wanted to introduce the Agency of Agriculture's new agrochemical toxicologist that is within the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management, Pam Breyer, sitting here to my left.
Oh, you didn't see I was doing ridiculous things like.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Look at the camera.
Introduce yourself. We're really excited to have Pam on board, though.
I've been trying to figure out what I was going to say and trying to figure out what would be useful for you guys to know about me. It starts back when. So I have a master's degree in behavioral ecology, studying the behavior of wood frogs, and I have undergrad research in slimy sculpin predator-prey interactions. So I don't come completely knowledgeless, I just made up a word, about animals. My PhD is in environmental toxicology, which really is the movement of pollution through the environment, how it gets around, how it gets into organisms, and the effects in. So my interest isn't in public health as much. That's the state toxicologist. So please continue to seek her with those questions. But what really interests me is how pollution moves through the environment, those types of issues. I come to this position from 6 years at the state of Maine as the pesticides toxicologist. And there, my role was much more confined to pesticides, not all of agricultural inputs. And it's been interesting listening to the discussion here about how agencies interact, because when we're talking about deer harvest, that's actually a priority issue for the management of pesticides and getting the public to use fewer pesticides. Deer management is a part of that because those hard to harvest areas are the ones that are close to people's properties. And those are the people that are going out and applying acaricides to take care of the ticks and mosquitoes in their lawns. And those bigger issues can be managed at the landscape level with deer numbers. So I put something about a deer meeting in March on my notes.
That sounds really interesting.
To participate in.
So what about snapping turtles?
Interesting. I will look it up.
Check it out.
See what there are for numbers.
Accumulation of snap turtles.
I mean, definitely with their age, right? But that's part of what's really interesting. My PhD was actually in toad uptake of a heavy metal when it was overwintering on a superfund site. So that was a special kind of scenario, but it's still part of how does the natural ecology interact with the contaminants that are out there. So what else is interesting about what I can do for the community?
I think when we get to the conference,
Well, the intersection that just pops into my mind is bees and neonicotinoids and other, site concerns since we've been listing bees left and right.
But you're talking about the real bees, not the managed bees, right?
Real bees.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, that's important. I know I've started on the mountain of reports. But I've only been here for 4 weeks. So give me some time. There are pollinator protection plans that pesticide programs have, right? And I actually haven't found. We're talking about where we're going with different documents that the agency has actually put together already.
The agency has the Ag Innovation Board, and so there's, they've made recommendations regarding neonicotinoid use in treated seeds so far. So, yeah, so I mean, we're involved and we have conversations. If you want, we can, I hadn't thought of providing an update regarding the AIB, but I would happy to do so at a subsequent meeting.
Yeah.
About their report and their recommendations.
One of the other things that's really topical right now in pesticides is the EPA has been sued multiple times in the last 20 years for failure to promulgate ESA in the registration of pesticides. And this past year, they just settled what is called the mega suit. And as part of that settlement, EPA is taking these very bold, fast actions. Even some of EPA's biggest critics are saying, holy smokes, what are you guys doing? That's crazy protective. And so what we're about to see in the next 5 years is a massive change, unless industry sues, and that will be held up in courts. But EPA is kind of at a moment where they're trying to retain their ability to regulate pesticides without all those actions going to the court system and it be settling in the court system. So they are aggressively setting deadlines right now. We have deadlines coming up this year for massive changes in pesticide registration. And it's something that this group will hear about, but it's actually a federal listed species issue. But pesticide applicators, when they pull up a pesticide product and they read that label, if that label says, go to this website called Bulletin's Live 2, the pesticide applicator has to go to the website and the rules for applying the pesticide will be different in that location. And it's all in response to critical habitats for listed species. And it's hugely topical. In the state of Maine, we hadn't had any of these areas where that labeling would have applied. We just got our first area in the state. It's all of Aroostook County, which is all of actual agriculture in the state of Maine. And then when you look forward to EPA expanding how they apply this for pesticides in the future, I went through, so there are 12 listed species in the state of Maine, and I laid out their maps over the state, and it's about 80% of the state of Maine would have either a prohibition of pesticide application completely, or the applicator would have to reach out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ask permission, and they would have to follow a list of mitigation measures where they wouldn't be allowed to apply the pesticide unless they did X, Y, and Z. And I just started reading some of the water resource, what's that?
The Water Quality Division? The required ag practices?
The required ag practices is kind of an interesting document because in Vermont, a lot of what is required of growers right now are some of the things that EPA is adding to what applicators have to do for ESA. So it was starting to look like Vermont growers would have an easier adaptation to some of the required practices moving forward because some of that is already in place right now. So that's something really fascinating to look at. It's going to change a lot. Pesticide world will be talking about it a lot as we move forward. And they've started with a vulnerable species project. And so you can go to the EPA website, vulnerable species story map. They have 27 species that are high priority where they worked out with Fish and Wildlife, what species they think would most benefit from changes in pesticide application. And a lot of those are insects. And you can pull out that story map and you've got, it's interactive. There's nothing in Vermont that's interesting on that map just yet, but then you can see what some of the required or some of the proposed mitigations will be for those species. That's one of the programs. EPA has also opened up the door on herbicide strategy because they essentially said, how can we make the biggest changes now? And that was looking at agriculture, and the one chemical by volume that agriculture uses the most are herbicides. So let's look at how can we quickly review all herbicides for all endangered species and all critical habitats. And they're coming up with this kind of blanket change in use for herbicides. So it's like 1,700 listed species, plus they're including the critical habitats. And when EPA does these registration reviews, I don't know, many of you have ever looked at a pesticide label. But the pesticide label, like when you buy your off, it says it's a prohibition against law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with the labeling. Well, that's federally enforceable language. And that's a very simple label. When you get to actual herbicides that farmers and growers use, they can be 50 to 80 pages long with super detailed instructions. Any deviation from that is a violation of law. And that's what the program, the pesticide program does, is follow up on stuff like that. So instead of going through every single use of every single herbicide in order to make this rapid change in law, what EPA is going to say is this is a herbicide type X. If it's this type of herbicide in this type of habitat, you have to do these kind of mitigations. And essentially hoping that they can make preemptively the changes for endangered species that they would have gotten to with a more thorough review. So they're taking like the most conservative steps that they can right now. And we're looking forward to the release of a rodenticide strategy. They've released portions of that. So that's really germane to the mammal people here. And there's proposed major changes in all rodenticides, not just second generation anticoagulants, which are the ones that build up in the food chain. That has actually been proposed, and we can provide you guys with more information on what that looks like. And we've started talking to dairy farmers because that's one of the areas within the applicator community where there could be the biggest impacts for that coming through. So we don't know exactly what the insecticide strategy is going to look like and or the fungicide strategy. So upcoming in the next year, EPA will be releasing their plans for each of these types of pesticides and how they expect those changes, what they will look like. But just on the brief outset, some of them set up zones where there's a map set by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and it's a PULA, pesticide use limitation area, where no pesticides can be used, and then a 1,000-foot buffer around it where you can apply pesticides as long as you do X, Y, and Z. And they usually involve buffers, wind screens, hooded sprayers, like all sorts of modifications that can prevent drift or can prevent runoff, depending on the type of pesticide. So I feel like I've been talking to pesticide applicator groups in Maine about this and kind of saying, there's a lot of change. You should worry. I can't tell you anything specific. Sorry, right? Like we know that there's a lot of changes coming. And EPA has put out a couple proposals, but we have no idea what it will really look like. But we should expect seeing pesticide labels changing. Pesticides are renewed each year by each state, and that label that gets issued by the state, those should start changing this year into next year for these changes. So, and I didn't get a chance. One of the things I wanted to do as homework is I wanted to go to all y'all's maps and see what you have for ranges of listed species at the state level and how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife maps overlay those, because it could be really interesting. But there's a lot coming on. There's a lot coming on the pesticide front. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I think there's going to be a lot of confusion among the applicator community because they're going to know there's a state listed species X and somebody's going to say, oh, you can't apply here. It's like, well, pesticide law doesn't care about the state level, but the state may choose to do something more too. So, yeah.
So your title is agrichemical, but these applicators talking about could be any applicators, so it could be mosquito control or lamprey control or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Or is it just?
No, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets is the state lead agency for pesticide. So any pesticide, your insect repellents being applied to children in daycare, your disinfection of wastewater treatment facilities, like everything that's a pesticide goes through us.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm also one of a radical group of Salisbury residents who's voted not to have adulticide mosquito control in our town, which last year, of course, was not received well by everybody, but yeah.
You know, that is always a fascinating topic. Adult.
And I think those, I would say, yeah, I mean, you've just heard, I think, probably the three biggest pesticide issues that we've dealt with. So the adulticide has brought up in the realm of endangered bat species. Some of those are federal bats, federally listed bats. Lampricide and I don't know that we don't have any federally listed fish, do we? But lots of state listed fish, as well as species of special concern for reptiles and amphibians, and then neonicotinoids and listed bee species. Ken, how many listed bee species do we have?
There's four bumblebees are listed.
And any of those federal as well?
Yes, rusty patch bumblebee.
Okay.
But it's unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your attitude, we don't fall within one of the states that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has declared current range for the rusty patch, because they've been gone for a long enough time from here. So you can actually do a taking and whatnot and not get in super big trouble federally for them if you would happen to find one here.
Has anybody seen one? The last rusty
Not-
patch in Maine was 2006.
1999, last one in Vermont.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. Paul, and then Brian.
Yeah, just a quick question on the EPA rules. Is that going to apply to homeowners as well, who, you know, kind of have this, I don't know, ability to go buy whatever the heck they want? Not quite, but, you know, and use it in a way that they don't really have to follow the rules because there's no enforcement.
Now turn them in. That's what our agency does. Go after them. I'm speaking for us.
And we have, if, you know, we're knowledgeable about it.
Oh, it's,
but we're not in
Right.
everyone's yard.
it's one of my biggest heartbreaks. We don't have enough people to go after all the people.
But you know what I mean? You
So,
go buy a neonicotinoid and dump it on your, you know, your flowering crabapple, and, you know, it's gonna wipe out the bee population in the neighborhood.
well, just as a little point, like there are neonics that are used on bees, right? So honeybees are managed with acetamiprid to control varroa mites, which are actually a really big pest of the managed pollinators. But so right now, the Endangered Species Act changes that are coming from EPA, none of that applies to homeowner products very specifically. But that doesn't mean what we're going to see won't. And in fact, when you look at the changes they did for rodenticides, they've removed everything out of the hands of homeowners with those proposed changes, essentially. And there's just a real funny patchwork of available chemistries, but it takes all second generation anticoagulants out of homeowner use. So I think yes and no, and we will see. That's the biggest non-answer I've had.
No, that's helpful. Thanks.
Go ahead, Brian.
Is there some loophole for neonic treated seeds, however? And is that something that it sounds like this might be something you can track in the environment?
A loophole in that homeowners can get a hold of them. I'm sorry if you can.
Or that there's some, like these no sprayers, so the regulations, yeah, they may cover spraying of neonics, but not neonic treated seeds.
Oh, so a neonic treated seed isn't considered a pesticide. It's a regulated article. So it's different. Yes. I don't know if it's a loophole. I mean, many of the requirements that are applied that address the neonicotinoid pesticide, those label requirements transfer to the seed, like that it spans. And you still have to use the seed in accordance with that label. So I don't know that it's like a loophole, I guess. I mean, to use your word.
Yeah.
But That's what you guys have spent the last year talking about.
Yes, yes. And actually, I put the AIB recommendations in the chat for this committee, so you can click on the link. And I also put the ginseng landing page in the chat for this meeting, so you can find that. So there's information in there from the Ag Innovation Board. And also, I want to make a plug for, there was a neonicotinoid treated seed webinar series that UVM Extension put on with Heather Darby. And I will find the link because you can watch the videos. They were hour-long chats, and there's a tremendous amount of information regarding neonicotinoid treated seeds and research being done both at the University of Vermont Extension and in Cornell. And so just really good information. So I'll try to find that too.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, well, thanks to both of you. Pam, welcome. Great to have you here. So yeah, thanks for all you're doing. And yeah, Stephanie's are in the chat, so thanks for that. Okay, we will transition here to SAG annual reports, and Bryophytes, and Dorothy, you're up first. I guess I'll just say, you know, I think I've given everyone 15 minutes. If you, you know, feel the need to take less time with that, that's totally fine. So.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dorothy. Yep.
Okay. Before I start, I want to compliment the other SAGs on all the work they've been doing. I read through at least some of the reports, and it's pretty impressive. And I got a lot of good ideas reading them that we might want to consider putting forward for our SAG. To go on, this is a new SAG, the Bryophyte SAG. We've had 2 meetings. We'll meet again at the end of January. And we started with 4 members. Now, number of people were asked, but most of them said, great, do good work. And most people didn't feel like they were qualified to join. If there are other people you know about who might want to be part of it, please let us know. Of those 4, 1 stepped down. That was Kristen Coe. She's a professor at Middlebury College. She stepped down in April. That leaves Matt Peters, who's sitting with you, and Eric Sorensen, who many of you know. We started by setting a main objective, primary objective, which was to review and update the rarity rankings for bryophyte species and the ranking methods, and to maintain the Vermont bryophyte list. To give you some background, the list was put together initially back in 2003, 2004 by me under a contract with the Fish and Wildlife. And I have maintained it pretty much myself since then. The list contains all the species of bryophytes that we know about in Vermont, as well as their global conservation status ranks and their state conservation status ranks. And over the course of time, I've just updated those ranks and the species list as needed and as I had time for it. One of the big time-consuming things right now is a lot of the names have changed as people are studying bryophytes, and keeping up to date with those names is a challenge. However, Missouri Botanical Garden has a nice website called bryonames.org, and in that website they actually have committed to telling you what the currently accepted name for various species is, along with their synonyms. So that's a really great resource for us. I think I will be able to get through this more quickly than 15 minutes. The other thing that I wanted to mention as we move forward, I feel like a lot of the work that's been done on bryophyte conservation and ranking in the last 20 years has been done without enough interaction with the Fish and Wildlife Department through nobody's fault. Last year or the year before, I don't remember, Aaron Marcus was able to get some people to help incorporate some of the data on occurrences of rare bryophyte species into the Heritage Program Biotics database. And a lot was accomplished then, but it wasn't finished. More work needs to be done there. We'd like to understand how we could facilitate that. Also, back whenever the the Wildlife Action Plan was last revised or put together or whatever, I worked with Bob Pop to get bryophytes incorporated into that. And so I hope that with this current revision, we can revise that and continue to work to incorporate bryophytes into that plan. That's about all I have to say. You have the report in front of you. Just one more thing, which is that over the course of that 20 years that I've been working on it, I started out ranking everything. Some people didn't like that because they didn't think we had enough data to come up with good ranks, and they were right for a number of species. But what's happened over the years is as we've accumulated data, we've narrowed and honed in on what I think is the correct rank, given the ranking system that I've been using. And so what has happened is that species that were considered rare because we didn't have very much data on them have become, the rank has gone, never know whether to say up or down, but it's gone from S1 to S2, for example. A number of species known historically have now been discovered again, and those generally go from SH to S1 or S2. And so it's been very helpful, I think, to have those ranks as a starting point and to work forward from. So that's what I have to say. Matt is a member of the committee. If he has anything to add, that would be fine. Or if there are any questions.
I think you've covered it well. I would just add the point that you also have in the report there that we continue to find, document new species of bryophytes in the state, which is true of many of our I guess, less studied taxonomic groups. But
Matt's being modest. He's found most of the new species of late. So.
Yeah, and if I could just respond about Fish and Wildlife involvement, it's certainly not out of interest to be more involved and be more up to date on records. And I think, we talked about this and we talked about forming these new SAGs that we would probably be unable to find the capacity to do, to add more work on these new suites of species as much as we'd like to. So that continues to be the reality. And we also haven't replaced Aaron Marcus yet. So there's that. So we're even further behind on the data backlog in Natural Heritage Database. And we actually were gunning for a position shared with DEC that would allow us to have an assistant botanist who was fully employed because we've been relying too long on having an assistant botanist as a temp. And given what we require from that person, a temp doesn't really cut it normally. And that we are unable to get a position for within Fish and Wildlife Department. So we're hoping to share a position with DEC. But they too are having a hard time getting new positions after having gotten a whole bunch with the new federal funding through ARPA. And so, we're still trying for that, but it's looking like we're going to have to go another round with hiring a temp, which we're starting now to undergo that process. So that will hopefully help us catch up a little bit. And Grace Glenn, our new botanist, is amazing. She's doing a really great job and jumping into a lot of things. right off the bat. And she, but she's full up. She's very full up with what she has on her plate. And still, getting used to that position. So, not to make excuses, I just want to make it clear that the interest is there. It's the capacity that we just can't find.
Yeah, and I don't say that, I didn't say what I said in a critical way at all.
Yeah.
I just want you to know that we're here. Let us know how we can help, if we can help.
Well, I think you are by doing like the lion's share of the work for that committee that's going to inform our work, and for ESC and for Fish and Wildlife. So I really appreciate it because without you, Dorothy, frankly, I don't think it would be happening, and Matt, the two of you. So we really appreciate your efforts. It's
okay, Brian,
heroic.
did you?
Well, I'm debating whether this is germane, but so you've given up on this full-time shared botanist position?
Nope.
Okay.
No, we will never give up. We will keep trying, but for the moment, we need somebody to be doing that work, and it could be a while to get a position approval. That could be a long process, and we're not getting green lights about it. It's very yellow at the moment. So we don't want to wait any longer because the backlog grows. So
okay,
yeah.
might we have a role in getting position approval, either even at the House budget writing process?
I believe that it's a challenge even when the funding is there. And with our botany work, because of the lack of federal funding opportunities, any botany work is particularly reliant on state funding right now, which we're going through some pretty big budget cuts. So it's a challenging time for not just getting a position, even if the funding is there, but also getting the funding for this particular position. I don't think that's the biggest part of what's in the way, though. I think it's really just the ability to add positions.
Just following up on what Brian said, I think probably any SAG chair that's been here for any period of time knows that you need additional positions.
Yeah.
In order to do what we think you need to do.
Yeah.
And if there was an opportunity for us to provide input to the secretary or the legislature, happy to do that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And as you can appreciate, sometimes we're in an awkward position of needing to not appear as though we're advocating for something that goes against the governor's interest.
So we just got to do it. You don't have to answer.
Wait, I'm sorry. Was that John? Was that you? I can't see. I couldn't tell who was talking.
No, it wasn't.
Another guy.
Nobody.
Okay, I'm not gonna hold you to it, but yeah, okay.
No, I'm just telling you the reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got you. I got you.
You could have asked the same question to any division director in state government 20 years ago, and you'd probably be asking the same question 20 years from now. Could you use more staff capacity? And the answer would always be, well, of course we could.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of factors that come into play, not just funding that weighs into those opportunities. And it's always an awkward dance when legislature's in session. There's never been a governor that I've been familiar with, Democrat or Republican, who's been comfortable with programs going in and asking the gross effect.
There's
Well,
any
we
way
even the temp,
officially,
we don't have,
unofficially.
but we don't even have the temp. As terrible as that was to have it be a temp position for so long. So that's not even been filled.
No, because we were working on the permanent position idea, but recently we realized we can't afford to wait any longer, and we'll keep pursuing that. But in the meantime, we're gonna hire a temp, because by the time if we did get something permanent, something shared with DC, I mean that'll take several months anyway. So we need to hire somebody no matter what as a temp. Yeah.
Thank you for continuing efforts to make that from.
Yeah, it's core work.
One thing, Dorothy, and thanks for the report that I'll mention is, I'm guessing, I mean, it seems like the S rank of bryophyte biologists is pretty low. But I'm also wondering about the G ranks and just kind of thinking, I think some of the SAGs and maybe it's the invert SAG has really reached out to experts much more broadly than just in Vermont. And so just thinking about if you're kind of looking for additional experts or additional people power on the committee, you might just think about who are some of the experts in New England or more broadly that might be able to give you some help on some of the tasks.
Right, in terms of G ranks, there was a movement a year or so ago led by Scott Schutte from the Pennsylvania Heritage Program, or Western Pennsylvania perhaps, to get together a group of people to work on global ranks. But I haven't seen, I should touch base with him again and find out what's going on with that. In terms of getting people involved with our SAG from outside of Vermont, there are a lot of good bryologists in Quebec. And I know some of them personally. I can ask. I belong to the, I can't pronounce it, group. And
Protection of,
it's in French. I can't pronounce
Yeah.
it.
Well, I just it means worth thinking about if
Sure,
if that would
sure.
be, potentially be helpful. So just kind of, yeah.
We have talked about doing some projects together, which would be fun.
Mhm. Yeah.
And just to be clear on that, there's no limits to who's in a SAG in terms of
No.
residency.
Right.
I mean,
No.
we've had
No.
people from out of state. We've never had anybody from Quebec, but if that's where the good people are,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
get them on the SAG if they're willing to do that.
Yeah.
I haven't asked them specifically, but I have a feeling that there's so much work to be done in bryology that and Quebec is a big place, big place.
Yeah.
It would be fun to ask though. I can send some feelers out.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks, Dorothy.
Sure.
And we are Savannah. You are up. Fungal SAG.
And I'm very quick. So in summary, we've had 3 large group meetings in 2023, and then we actually have a leadership team. We have 4 additional meetings with the leadership group. We have 10 active members and 2 who would like to join. We have Sandra Lavia and Meg Madden, and I sent the CVs, or it's in the Teams folder with everything. So if we could get approval on that, I'd appreciate it. We have no suggested listings or taking permits, but we do have a lot of priority work updates. So we started reviewing existing records of Fungaria, and we've looked upwards of over 80,000. So this is over 3,000 species. We're working with BCE to develop a clearinghouse, so we can take all of these records from citizen science databases to help create a starting list or like backbone for fungi in Vermont. So that's been really exciting, and Ken actually, right before this meeting, I guess it'll be on our 2024 report, started that for us. So we're really excited about that. We did decide as a group to use IUCN Red List rarity categories in addition to our state S ranks. And this is going to be not evaluated, data deficient, least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered, and then extinct in the wild, and then extinct totally. And this is just because when we think about fungi, and we can just talk macro fungi, as you're observing them in nature, one fruiting body could be 2 or 3 meters away from another fruiting body of the same species and be genetically the same organism. So just counting isn't really going to help us know what's really out there. So it's kind of going to get a little messy, but we hope to have a nice little table where we can say exactly what S ranks go to that. And then besides that, we're continuing conservation and outreach, getting the public involved with fungi and why we care about fungi. We've done a ton of presentations. A lot of people in our group are continuing to publish papers in mycorrhizae, and that's several pages of just presentations and papers. Similarly, we don't have any fish and wildlife involvement. And when I first pitched fungal SAG, and the offer still stands, is I can be that person. So Danny Fitzko has allowed that to happen. So if there's any like training or what Fish and Wildlife used to do, I know there's different access to the heritage database, different levels, but if there's any way that I could be involved more with what Fish and Wildlife would have been doing on our SAG, I'm game for it. That's it. Elevator pitch.
Great to have you here. It's great to have the fungal group starting up. It's great to have the bryophyte group starting up. It's fantastic. Good luck.
Thank you.
I'm impressed by the number of species you have.
Yeah, and that's only looking at macro fungi. Like, it's getting, yeah, it's gonna be a lot because we're hoping to do like animal pathogens, plant pathogens.
Yeah.
So all of it. Lichen is getting, we're gonna have to reach out to the firefight folks because that's messy. We'll get there. Yes.
What does your discipline look like when it intersects with agriculture?
Yeah, so I, like for the SAG or like my role specifically?
Both.
Okay, so my role specifically, I work out of the Randolph lab at BTC. So I work really closely with Judy Rogoski and Eddie Emnue. So doing all the invasive pests and pathogens for the state. And anytime they find something in the nursery or need another ID, I'll ID that for them and vice versa. So like when things are for L-4, for example, it's like a FPR test, but ag assist because we overlap so much. Spotted lanternfly, it's going to be an ag pest, but I'm assisting just because again the overlap is there. And then as the SAG, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to use the lab having part of the state fungarium there. We currently, Agency of Ag and FPR share an insect room that has a lot of our invertebrates for the state collection. So using that as a clearinghouse and then also being able to take the nursery pathogens, hopefully, and getting those documented and curated into the collection. And data.
And then for soil health, is there any interaction?
I don't do any soil. I'm above ground.
Okay.
You mean you don't talk about the millions of miles of mycelium under?
So our group is made of some really passionate folks who aren't necessarily employed by the state. So I'm bringing the plant path lens to our group, and then there's people who only work on slime molds, which is really cool and amazing. So there's other folks who are more in tune with like Zacto mycorrhizae and stuff. Yeah, but I'm hoping with the Wildlife Action Plan, we can be involved because like as we're losing ash right across the landscape, what about the ash tree bolete, right? Like we need to keep an eye on that, see how population. And
I was going to go to Dorothy first.
Yeah, I read your report and I wanted to follow up on something that was in it. Back in around probably 2016, 2017, we had received a grant at the University of Vermont through the National Science Foundation to database the macrofungi. So all of the macrofungi at UVM in the Pringle herbarium were databased and put in the MyCo portal. It doesn't seem to quite jive with what you put in your report. What happened was they were organized at that time. I was in charge of that digitization project and they were organized at that. But then the Torrey Hall fire happened. And luckily, none of those specimens were damaged because they were in a side room. But they all did get moved over to Jeffords. So I'm just wondering what the status of that collection is now, if you know. And I just want to make sure that you were aware that those were all databased, not the microfungi, as I recall, it was just macro, but I believe all the macrofungi in the herbarium at that point in time had been database.
Yeah, so we are aware of that. That was the second fungarium list that we started with, and we're still we're in contact with the person. I can't think of their name off the top of my head, but maybe you have it. We're just trying to transfer some of the data that they do have. Not everything went into Myco portal, so we're just filling in the gaps there. And there's still specimens that need to be vouchered. So we have like small working groups within our SAG trying to get that done.
I see. Yeah, that and are they in Jeffords Hall now?
Yeah.
Great, thanks for that, Dorothy.
I just wanted to mention that there's a bill H664 to name a state mushroom.
The state mushroom.
The bear's head tooth mushroom. I just wanted to share that. And I don't know anything about the bear's head tooth mushroom. I think it's it's a good one.
Good, isn't it a good angling thing
It's
out
a
there?
It's a charismatic.
Oh, cool.
Who brought it forward? I know.
I don't know. Well, so it's introduced by Representatives Buzz Lunn of Westminster, and then there's a list of people, but that's the first name listed. But I think it's a class.
Yeah.
Students. Yeah. You didn't know about.
I didn't know about that, but I get like every tooth fungi gets sent to me. Like, can I eat this? Because I always think it's the bear.
And they want you to get it back.
Is that mushroom
Yeah, I know,
psychoactive?
they send it. A lot of them telling adults we can't eat things.
Follow up, just, that it was interesting to see what, or hear a little bit about what you guys are doing in terms of the S ratings and using the red list categories too. And just maybe outside of this meeting, it seems like there might be some, for the bryophyte SAC, thinking about alternative methodologies. Maybe there's would be some value in it. Or might get out of it. So
Yeah, we'll set up a meeting.
do you feel similarly?
Yeah, John.
I think your notes have answered my question. I was gonna ask you, is there like a Vermont Mycological Society that you referenced, the Vermont Mycoflora Project? Is that like, is that the opportunity for citizen scientists to participate in
Yeah, so
understanding the distribution and abundance of fungi?
yeah, and a lot of that is coming from iNaturalist databases, but like MycoPortal, and there's a few others that any citizen science can. And a lot of folks who are really passionate about mycology are like postal workers, and they just have normal jobs, and not everybody can be employed to work with fungi all day, so I'm really lucky. But they're some of our leading experts, so they're still able to access these databases. So yes, and we're hoping to pull all of these, and there's like 4 or 5 together that we can pull out like research grade, follow up on things that might be rare, threatened, and endangered, and then kind of have a meeting.
Well, like you, Jim, I'm thrilled that we've got these 2 new groups going to deal with a set of species that really needs some attention. So thanks for all of your work. I'm also looking, when is Fungi Fest?
Fungi Fest that happened this past September.
Oh, shoot.
At the North Branch Nature Center. We talked about making it a reoccurring thing. It was hosted by the North Branch Nature Center, who has some members who are on our SAG. So we just invited the public to come out for all things fungi. We had vouchering stations. So they did a 4-hour foray in the morning, brought everything back. And then we were all vouchering and IDing together. And then there was also different presentations going on. And then we had an artist come, how you can make paint with different types of fungi. So it's just trying to get the community involved in thinking about mushrooms.
Well, if you do it again, I'd love to attend.
Yes, I'll make sure to share the link.
Little known fact about myself, and will tell you something about me as a child, at least. When I was in high school, I was a member of the Connecticut Mycological Society. Exciting.
When I was in elementary school, I ended up in the hospital as a result of messing with an amanita. I was remembering that story.
Yeah.
I always wondered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For myself.
Yeah. It was exciting though.
How bad can snapping turtles be, really? Come on. Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for that, Savannah. I guess I'll just mention, I think that some of the, original concerns that came up from the department when we were talking about a new bryophyte and a new fungi SAG had to do with essentially staffing those. And technically in our operations guidelines, it doesn't specifically say that a SAG needs to be staffed by a personnel from the department. And I think, part of what happened in terms of sort of alleviating that concern was, both Dorothy and Savannah were saying, our job right off the bat is not to be proposing species for listing. We're really talking about really understanding the biodiversity of these groups. And so for, probably quite some time, these are going to be groups that are really devoted to understanding the biodiversity of these taxa in Vermont and really trying to understand the status and distribution. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It would be nice to get it all in natural heritage though.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so we've got Savannah shared a couple of CVs for consideration for new members to the fungal SAG, and I don't know. We'll see if I can I actually pull these up, maybe. And if you want to say anything real quick about these two folks. Savannah.
Then Meg Madden is a psychologist who that's just her job, I guess. She goes around doing a lot of outreach and does a lot of 4-H privately. Both great and really awesome resources to have.
She knows her mushrooms.
She does, yeah.
She knows her mushrooms. I've listened to many conversations on gill and pore structure.
Was a student of mine in junior high school.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Yeah, and their CVs are both there and they're pretty comprehensive with work and outreach.
All right.
In case you sample one again.
I'm careful nowadays.
I guess so I'll just ask and maybe I'll put this forward as a motion to accept both new members, Megan and Hannah, for the fungal SAG. And then if folks are good with that, we can have any discussion if we're fine with a motion to do two at once.
So moved.
Second.
Great, thank you.
Who's second?
I
Brian?
think technically Paul came in slightly before Carla.
Sorry.
Any
the West Coast.
questions, comments?
Great. I mean, more the merrier. It seems like you guys are doing great work. Yeah, it's like it.
Yeah, I second that. All right, all those in favor of the two new members to the fungal SAG signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion passes. Great. Thank you, Savannah. Okay. Where are we? Did I put a break in here? I can't remember now. Okay, all right. So why don't we take a couple minutes and people can get up and stretch and take care of any business, and we'll be back in. Oh, are we on time now?
Just about.
No, we're not. We're
No, we're
behind. Yeah.
behind.
By 70, or well, more than 17
Yeah,
minutes.
exactly. Let's try to keep it to 5 minutes then.